Hello, my fellow strawmen, and welcome back to the Fields of Hay. Today I found a video from Ken Ham that he thinks I will hate. He's probably right, but at least I'll get some catharsis out of explaining why he doesn't know what he's talking about.
Have you ever heard this? Billions of years ago, there was an explosion in space. Or 100,000 years ago, this happened or that happened. Or even, in the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. Question, how does anyone know? I mean, was anybody there to observe it?
Nothing in science is about definitively knowing things. However, if a falsifiable idea has never been falsified despite intense scrutiny, and it makes specific predictions which do match reality, it's very reasonable to hold that idea as likely true. On the other hand, unfalsifiable ideas that make no specific predictions and which can be molded to match any possible reality aren't very useful and shouldn't be taken seriously. Over the course of this video, I hope we'll get into some of the ways evolution could be falsified and some of the predictions it has successfully made. I have no hope that Ken will share with us any potential ways to falsify God or share any specific predictions about reality based on God's existence.
Check this out. First of all, we need to recognize that there is a huge difference between observational science and historical science. Both are valuable, but very different. Let's define the two real quick, shall we? Observational science is simply when we observe something and experiment to draw conclusions. It involves repeatable experimentation and observations in the present. It's through observational science that we find cures for diseases and build space shuttles, stuff like that. Now, through historical science, we consider things that happened in the past, but they cannot be checked in the same way. I mean, we don't have access to the past like we do the present because, well, it's gone, right? All we really have is speculation, or at best, circumstantial evidences of past events based on what we see in the present. That's not to say that we can't make intelligent guesses about the past or form reasonable inferences from rocks or fossils in the present, but we certainly cannot directly test our conclusions because we cannot repeat the past.
I can understand the point that things in the past are harder to verify than things in the present. It's one thing to understand how rain and dew and sprinklers work, it's another to tell which one caused my lawn to get wet. But the actual process uses the same underlying logic either way. Only falsifiable ideas are considered to be valid propositions, and then we look for evidence to rule out the propositions that don't match reality. In other words, even though we can never directly recreate the past, we can look for evidence left behind which survived to the present.
Does that mean historical science is unimportant? Not at all. Let's drop an example down here for a minute and take a look at the Eiffel Tower. You know, that 19th century Parisian monument designed by Gustave Eiffel that stands 1,063 feet tall, which was built as the entrance for the 1889 World's Fair and is still the tallest building in Paris today, visited by millions of people each year? Yeah, that one. Well, guess what? Everything I just told you is true, but how do we test it? Well, applying observational science, we can, of course, observe the Eiffel Tower anytime we're in Paris. It's here in the present. Then, we can continue by testing the height and comparing it to all the other structures in Paris and confirm the claim that it is indeed the tallest building in Paris. But that's the extent of the kind of facts that can be proved by observational science in reference to this claim. How do we really know that Gustave designed it? How do we really know it was built in the 19th century as an entrance to the 1889 World's Fair? How do we really know how many people visited? That's all in the past. It can't be repeated. For that kind of information, we need to go outside the limits of observational science and discover what has been communicated to us through historical documents and eyewitness accounts.
The standards of evidence are the same in all cases, and the standard to meet to believe a claim is dependent on the nature of the claim. In both the past and the present, documentation and eyewitness testimony is sufficient to believe that a particular piece of architecture was built by a particular person. Even for some mundane claims, it helps to have independent testimonies that corroborate each other. But to believe that a miracle happened, like somebody rising from the dead, no amount of documentation or testimony can suffice. We simply need better types of evidence. The difference is that, in the case of the Eiffel Tower's construction, we know that all the pieces of the story are plausible. Steel is a good construction material, cities hold fairs, and people design buildings. Since the framework is solid, it only takes a handful of documents to reliably fill in the details of who built it and when. However, if the claim was that Gustave flew the final piece to the top of the tower like Superman, I need some evidence that humans can fly before I accept the claim. Or I need some very strong evidence that it happened despite the fact that humans can't fly. I do know that people can lie, be mistaken, or just make up stories for fun, and I'd be much more inclined to believe any of those options above Gustave actually flying.
And furthermore, we have to believe those eyewitnesses and documents are trustworthy. The same is true when we talk about the origin of the Earth. The Earth is here. We all agree with that. So, does observational science confirm that the world was created by God, and are there trustworthy documents and eyewitness accounts that confirm it? Well, let's take the last part first. In short, what we're really asking is my original question: was anybody there to observe it? The answer is yes. God was there, and he told us how he created. He inspired people to write down his very words that became books that were compiled into a complete book called the Bible, which has been verified over and over again and has demonstrated itself to be totally trustworthy in all it claims and teaches. Even secular scholars will concede that the Bible accurately records historical events. Anyway, we have the most trustworthy revelation from the most trustworthy eyewitness.
Don't make me laugh. I just said the testimony isn't enough for miracle claims, and the creation of the universe from nothing is a miracle claim. Returning to the Eiffel Tower example, even if we could verify all the history, that wouldn't make my story about Gustav flying up the final piece true. In the same way, verifying the history of the Bible does not lend credence to the miracle claims. I believe that the Bible was written entirely by humans, without divine influence, and that it mixes mythological stories with cultural history. Why Ken and Friends finds the Bible trustworthy on all counts, I'd love to know.
Now, what about observational science? Does it confirm the Bible? Yes. And what's extremely important to realize is the observable fact that the universe is logical and orderly. That makes sense only if its creator is logical and has imposed order on his creation. It doesn't make sense at all if the universe is just an accident of a huge explosion.
The universe being an accident of a huge explosion is entirely a straw man, and irrelevant to the point. The choices aren't between randomness and God, it's between God and not God. Why is it impossible for a universe that wasn't designed by a god to contain logic? No explanation is ever given here. It is simply an empty claim that logic requires a god.
Our minds are able to comprehend many things about the universe, and that's only possible if the creator of the mind gave us the ability and desire to explore the universe. It doesn't make sense if our brains are byproducts of chance because we couldn't trust their conclusions to ever be accurate.
Calling our brains byproducts of chance is a gross misrepresentation of evolution, completely leaving out the part about selection. Brains that couldn't accurately process information about reality weren't much good and got weeded out. This little intro is incredibly incredulous about atheism, but it never backs up why.
It only makes sense that we can observe and repeat an experiment if the universe consistently obeys the same laws from day to day, which only makes sense if a lawgiver created it that way and upholds it.
Why can't it make sense for things to be consistent without a lawgiver? Wouldn't the lawgiver have to be consistent in its existence? Besides special pleading, why can the lawgiver be intrinsically consistent but the universe can't? This whole intro about how the Bible is such a trustworthy eyewitness that it should be trusted over science, and science confirms the Bible anyways, is all absolute sophistry. I'll link a video here I made about the nature of math and physics, but the way I see it, there is no reason to infer that the laws of nature must have come from a pre-existing mind.
One of the verses of scripture that I've had at the forefront of my mind has been 1 Peter 3:15, where it says, always be prepared to give a defense or to give an answer.
I appreciate this. When I was a believer, I too tried to find a good reason to believe. I wanted to make sure I wasn't following any false prophets and that I wasn't misleading others by being confidently wrong. Turns out the standards I came up with to assess the validity of my beliefs and the claims of others made me an atheist.
So let's start off with the first question here. Is there any evidence for an infinite God? That's one of the questions I've been asked. How do you know there's a God? Where did God come from?
Just so we're clear, whatever piece of reality that gets pointed to as evidence needs to have its inconsistency with atheism demonstrated. Otherwise, it's not exclusively evidence for an infinite God. It would also help if the God hypothesis made some specific prediction he could look for. But let's be honest, Ken is just going to find something he can point to incredulously under atheism, therefore God.
That information is not in the molecules. The molecules are arranged in a particular order to write the information. Just like when I open up my Bible and I can read it, but the information I'm reading is not in the molecules. The ink has been arranged into letters and into words and into sentences, and because I understand the language it's written in, that's where the information really is.
This is a very poor analogy. Actually, it's a fine analogy, it just makes the opposite point than what Ken thinks. The ink on the page is in fact made of molecules, and it is entirely fair to say that the distribution of molecules on the page determines which letter is conveyed. In both the written and biological cases, information is conveyed by the arrangement of molecules. Knowing the languages allows for the interpretation of the information, but the information is in the molecules.
But here's the interesting thing. You've got to have a language to read the information. And DNA itself has the information that makes the language to read the information, that makes the language to read the information, that makes the language to read the information. You get the idea? In other words, you've got to have the information, but you've got to have the language. If you don't have the language, then you can't read the information. It's all got to be there or it won't work.
I'll link a wonderfully detailed video here that explains how it all happens. But the short answer is that the genetic code of DNA is physically determined by the structure of ribosomes and transfer RNAs, both of which are capable of self-replication with mutation and therefore evolution. Back when it was just strips of RNA floating around, those that were able to loop around and bind to themselves, or bind to amino acids in the environment, would stabilize and become more likely to replicate. As time passed, the globs of RNA that were best at binding to the amino acids in their environment would continue to outcompete the rest, and those that formed their own peptides out of amino acids would be even better off. Coevolution, the driving force that creates signaling systems, can then proceed, as amino-binding globs benefit by bringing amino acids to the peptide-making globs, and the peptide-making globs benefit by consistently building small proteins that stabilize the amino-binding globs. This process eventually becomes the tRNAs bringing amino acids to the ribosome, and the codon assignments of the genetic code were born. Afterwards, specialization could happen. DNA derived from RNA and is incredibly good at storing information, but bad for functional structures due to the lack of variation. It's always the same double helix. Proteins made by the ribosome aren't very good for storing information, but can perform many functions due to their sheer variety. Is it really so hard to believe that the language of DNA and the current structure of our cells could come into existence naturally?
It's all got to be there at the same time. And you know one of the things that we found out? Languages only ever come from an intelligence, and information only ever comes from information. DNA cries out that there's an intelligence behind life. It couldn't have happened by chance random processes. Matter on its own could never produce DNA.
And there's the incredulity. Ken made an empty claim that languages only come from an intelligence, but he can't back it up. The key thing for the evolution of the genetic code is the creation of the codon assignments so that the words of the genetic language can be read consistently into a particular protein. This can be explained by the proto-ribosomes and the pre-transfer RNA being under evolutionary pressure to cooperate, which is a well-understood process.
For those who believe in evolution, they believe that millions of years ago, somehow life had to arise from matter. As you think about that, it's not just a matter of saying life arose from matter. Life is built on DNA. You've got to have DNA to arise from matter. But not just DNA, you've got to have a language system. Matter produces a language system. Matter has to produce information.
Random information is generated by mutations, and those that carry useful information are selected for. Information is conveyed simply by distinguishing one state from another, and so literally every mutation produces new information. In the case of words, any change to the sentence would at least imply that there was a typo, and at most completely change the meaning in an interesting fashion.
You know what's interesting? We've never seen matter produce one bit of brand new information that never previously existed. Not even one bit.
That statement is either misinformed or a lie. I see matter produce new bits of information all the time. Every time a bit flip glitch happens in a computer, information is produced, changing the output of the computation. Every time a flower's color pattern changes, information is produced, which insects will react to as a new stimulus. Every time a star explodes, information is produced, and we jot down which direction the light came from. It is trivial for matter to produce new information.
Can you give an example, we only wanted one, where matter produces information and adds it into the genes?
Okay, I'll give an example. If a gene duplication event occurs and one of the genes changes from the original, that is new information. Or if you want something earlier, a strand of RNA that doesn't quite replicate right and binds to a different amino acid, that is new information. Again, this type of thing happens literally every day and is trivial.
Here's Dr. Dawkins, who many years after that video clip was asked the question, how did life arise on Earth?
What do you think is the possibility that intelligent design might turn out to be the answer to some issues in genetics?
Let's take a vote. Everyone who heard Richard get asked the question, what do you think is the possibility that intelligent design might turn out to be the answer to some issues in genetics or in Darwinian evolution? Click like on this video. If you think the question he was asked was, how did life arise on Earth? Click dislike. Ken doesn't seem to understand that these aren't the same question.
It could come about in the following way. It could be that at some earlier time, somewhere in the universe, a civilization evolved by probably some kind of Darwinian means to a very, very high level of technology and designed a form of life that they seeded onto perhaps this planet. Now, that is a possibility and an intriguing possibility. And I suppose it's possible that you might find evidence for that if you look at the details of biochemistry, molecular biology. You might find a signature of some sort of design.
Do you know what he's talking about when he's talking about look at biochemistry and find a signature? He's talking about DNA. You know what he's really...
No, he isn't. You can't just cut somebody off and insert your own word into their sentence. It's very rude. Ken doesn't seem to understand that Dawkins isn't talking about DNA at all, but about the hypothetical possibility that a designer could have left a signature somewhere. And even if we find that signature, a god is not the only conclusion supported by the evidence. It's not even the best conclusion.
You might find a signature of some sort of designer.
Wait a second. Richard Dawkins thought intelligent design might be a legitimate pursuit?
And that designer could well be a higher intelligence from elsewhere in the universe.
Well,
but that higher intelligence would itself have had to have come about by some explicable or ultimately explicable process. It couldn't have just jumped into existence spontaneously. That's the point.
So Professor Dawkins was not against intelligent design, just certain types of designers, such as God.
Well, there you have it. There's one of the leading atheists in the world giving you the evidence to support his faith that life evolved. It came to Earth from outer space.
What a gross misrepresentation. Ken is portraying Dawkins as trying to use intelligent design as some way to get around explaining abiogenesis. No, he was asked a specific question about how he would interpret evidence of intelligent design should we ever find it. He admits that we can't rule out intelligent design, but if it did turn out to be true, evolution would still be the best explanation for the existence of the designers, and abiogenesis would still need to happen. Also, can we acknowledge what a massive red flag it was when they commentated over Dawkins? I haven't been able to hunt down the source clip, so I'll do my standard thing and assume that it had something to do with trimming down the context to misrepresent what Dawkins said.
Well, who made God? Oh, don't you just love those questions? And from a little boy like that, so how am I going to answer that? So I looked at him and said, well, son, if somebody made God, that'd have to be a bigger God who made God. Would that be right? Oh, yes, sir. Well, if you've got a bigger God who made God, then who made the bigger God? You have to have a bigger God who made the bigger God who made God, right? Oh, yes, sir. Well, who made the bigger God? You'd have to have a bigger God who made the bigger God who made the bigger God who made God, right? Oh, yes, sir. Do you know the only thing that makes sense, son? What's that, sir? You've got to have the biggest God of all, an infinite creator God. It's the only thing that makes logical sense.
That makes no sense at all. Making God infinite does not solve the problem. An omniscient God would be omnilingual. Ken says that a language cannot naturally exist, hence the need for DNA to be created. But if God can conceive of all possible languages, then he too could not naturally exist.
You learn at school about the laws of nature. Why are there laws that are the same today and tomorrow? If it's a random universe, it came about by random processes, why do we have the laws of nature? How can you trust them? Why do we have the laws of logic?
If some god mind just randomly popped into existence, how could you trust it to come up with natural laws and logic? The fact is, no matter what I choose to believe, I, in my limited human view, can never be certain that I understand why the universe is what it is. There is no way around this problem. But it doesn't matter, because the fact is, we have evidence from every moment of our existence that reality is self-consistent. We don't need to know why.
Well, another question I'm often asked. How could Noah fit all the species of animals on the ark?
This is an entirely uninteresting question for me, because I can answer it for him. If God exists and can work miracles, then he could have made the ark bigger on the inside than the outside, and also fed the animals with a preview of the feeding of the 5,000 he would later perform as Jesus. He could have teleported the animals to and from their home continents before boarding the ark, and solved the heat problem by blowing on the earth like a bowl of hot soup. Point is, I don't understand why Christians don't own up to the fact that their God was working miracles, and instead try to fit him into agreement with science. Seriously, Christian scientists are neither Christians nor scientists. They're just lost, and it's very sad.
Do you know what the secularists say about domestic dogs, for instance? They say the origin of the domestic dogs from wolves has been established, suggesting a common origin from a single gene pool for all dog populations. Even secularists would say that something like a wolf gave rise eventually to something like that. Poodles. People say, how could that give rise to that? Is that evolution? No, because evolution really should be more of, adding new information. What we see here is an incredible loss of information.
Ken misunderstands evolution so hard, he doesn't even reference its definition when claiming something to not be an example of it. I'm also pretty sure he has zero understanding of the mathematical definition of information, because if he did, he would know that new information is produced with literally every mutation. Ken's belief that evolution can't work is based on ignorance and incredulity. It is damn near criminal that he gets to spew this stuff to children.
If you're going to believe in evolution, like reptiles evolved into birds, reptiles have the information for scales, but don't have information on how to build a feather, which is a very complex structure. So for evolution, you've got to have matter producing information with all the instructions on how to make a feather if a reptile was to evolve into a bird.
Thank you, Ken, for bringing up a wonderful example of how information is created. Genes which originally carried information that directed keratin to form in one particular way mutated, and instead carried new information that directed keratin to be formed in a different particular way. Sometimes this wasn't a useful change. Sometimes the protection of the scales was lost and the organism died. But other times the change was useful, in part because various organisms across various environments experience a range of selection pressures. Perhaps some mutations formed a light matrix rather than a tough sheet. It may have been poor at fending off claws and teeth, but excellent at retaining heat. In some environments, that may be the more advantageous strategy. Organisms that can maintain a higher body temperature without spending as much energy are generally capable of running away faster, so maybe the loss of physical protection didn't matter much. Later, the genes for where the feathers grew and how big they each were could be selected for their ability to glide and eventually fly, making them more aerodynamic over time. Every change, every mutation is new information. I cannot stress enough how trivial it is to create new information.
We don't know how many dogs God made originally, but let's say there were 2 dogs, and they got married and had kids, and they got married and had kids.
I'm sorry, what? Ken just brushed by incest really casually.
Big A, little a, big B, little b. So here's a male and female dog, and imagine something like wolves. And you get one set of genes from the male, one from the female. Here we have 2 big A's, 2 big B's, 2 big C's.
Sure, sometimes that happens. Other times there's a mutation in the reproductive cells and a new gene variant, say C prime, gets passed on. New information.
Now, the dogs move towards a cold climate. Those that have short hair and medium hair get cold, and they die. And now you're only left with dogs that have L genes, who on their own will only ever produce dogs with what? L genes. They could never produce short hair or medium hair again.
This one I'm not giving Ken the benefit of the doubt. This is a lie. It is a blatant lie. It is a willful, ignorant lie to himself, and it is a manipulative lie to his audience. Ken himself admits that genes can degrade, and if one of the long-haired genes broke, the dog may simply grow shorter hair. And a minor point, but why did the audience chuckle when the dogs died?
Get cold, and they die. Overheat, they die.
What the fuck is this audience?
From a perspective of Darwinian evolution, you supposedly start with matter, no information, and over time, matter has to give rise to zillions of bits of information for all the information to build all the different kinds. So we should see increasing information all the time to build all these different kinds of animals and plants. Actually, what we observe is a loss of information, redistribution of information.
The second law of thermodynamics says that entropy must increase. Entropy is a count of number of states that a system could be in. Information is conveyed by the ability to differentiate between these states. Information and entropy are naturally linked, and they increase together. On the genetic level, literally every imperfection in the replication process produces new information. The new bits that turn out to be useful are kept around while the rest are tossed. If Ken could understand the second law, he might realize that it expects life.
It fits exactly with what the Bible would tell us. Actually, when we form different species, they actually have less information overall than the original, which means it's the opposite of evolution.
Ken isn't quoting any evidence here because if he is aware of any studies on information contained in genetic lineages, he knows that it usually increases over time. More likely, he isn't aware of any and is just making this little nugget of knowledge up.
And then you start to realize Noah didn't need anywhere near the number of animals on the ark that people think he did. He didn't need all the species of dogs, only 2. He didn't need the African elephants and the Indian elephants and the stegomastodons and the mastodons and the mammoths. He only needed 2 of the elephant kind.
You know, I forgot he was doing this to scientifically justify a miracle. The funny part is that most families of living species have allele variants of individual genes that can number in the dozens. Now, I'm not a biologist and don't know where to find specific info on this, so I'd welcome anyone who wants to help me out here. But I do understand evolution well enough to know that this should be a prediction, and my beliefs are in trouble if this isn't true. But if it is, then Ken has admitted that he has no way of explaining where these alleles come from. Were there a single pair of breeding animals on the ark, they could represent at most 4 alleles.
It's just today, it's best not to marry a close relative. And you know why? See, the Bible helps us understand this, and genetics helps fill in some details for us. Adam and Eve, when they were created, were perfect. But when they sinned, now everything's running down. God doesn't hold everything together perfectly anymore. He withdrew some of that sustaining power so things would run down, so we would die, because we forfeited our right to live. And so because of that, over time, mutations, changes in our genes occur. And what happens is this. Over time, each generation gets new mistakes, and they get added to the next generation, and they accumulate and get new mistakes.
I almost skipped this whole disgusting section on justifying incest, but I have to address this claim. It is laughable to think that the Bible provides a basis for the explanation, and genetics fills in the gaps. The truth is that to properly condemn incest, one can use genetics as the foundation and consent to fill in the gaps. The incest going on at the root of the biblical genealogy is in fact one of the things which would cause the genetic degradation that Ken's been harping about this whole time, which is a good enough reason to rule out any relationships that can make incest babies. Consent gets you to rule out any intergenerational incest, because any attempt to gain consent from your progeny is called grooming and is extremely fucked up. And at this point, even incest between two sisters can be ruled out by association as a kind of incest. Human societies have a justifiable sense of repulsion at incest, and it is not precise enough to turn it off for the less harmful cases. And to top it all off, Ken finally mentioned mutations, which don't accumulate as degradations under natural selection.
Actually, a brother and sister getting married originally is no different to a man and woman getting married today, because you're marrying your relative. It's just today you don't marry a close relative. Very easy to understand. Isn't it exciting when we get those answers?
After justifying incest with willful ignorance, he turns around and says, "Isn't it exciting when we get those answers?" What the fuck?
And then one other thing, people say, okay, but then how do you get all the different races of people?
I'm not going to spend much time on this section. His answers are very similar to how all the breeds of dogs came from one dog. It has all the same issues, so I won't repeat it. The stuff he says about skin color is oversimplified and not remotely the only thing that needs to be explained about the origin of different races. For example, why does Africa have massive amounts of genetic diversity while the entire rest of the world has relatively little?
Well, another question I'm often asked. Well, look, you talked about Noah's Ark there, but is there any evidence for a global flood? You know, one of the things that I say to people is this: if there really was a global flood, you'd expect to find billions of dead things buried in rock layers laid down by water all over the earth.
Sure, you'd expect to find billions of dead things buried in rock layers laid down by water all over the world. You might even expect that as the water levels receded, the massive lakes that would drain could carve canyons out of the still muddy sediment. Besides anything deposited at the mouths of these canyons in similar specific cases, you would expect one massive rock layer across the globe, or at most a few ordered by the density of the particles. You'd expect to see all sorts of different ecologies spread out across the layers, birds and fish and dinosaurs all jumbled together and mixed across the depths. You certainly wouldn't expect the dead creatures to be sorted by species. You wouldn't expect a smooth gradient as you go down in the ratio between pairs of radioactive nuclides and their daughters. You wouldn't expect alternating layers of ash and sediment. You wouldn't expect a layer consistently high in iridium spread evenly across the globe. You know what we do find? All of that. Funny how Ken's model can't make any predictions more specific than, "there's dead things below our feet," while evolution can say which region of Canada and which layer you should dig in to find Tiktaalik.
When I go to the Grand Canyon, I've been there with a park ranger, and you look down and you see all those rock layers and the fossils in the rock layers, and you see the big canyon there. I've stood on the edge of the Grand Canyon with a park ranger who said, "Do you realize a long time and a little bit of water did this?" I stood there and said, "Do you realize a lot of water and a little bit of time did this?"
And the park ranger said, "Do you realize that a lot of water and a little bit of time would have laid down one big layer, not the many distinct layers you can clearly see with your own two eyes?"
And it doesn't take millions of years to form fossils. At the Creation Museum, for instance, we have a fossil of a fish that was fossilized while it was eating another fish. That didn't happen over millions of years, did it?
My position is that the biblical flood did not happen. I'm not claiming that no natural disaster or cataclysmic event has ever happened. Yes, volcanoes have erupted and buried trees. Yes, there were mudslides preserving fish in the middle of a meal. None of this falsifies that fossilization can also happen over much longer periods.
The flood is the key to understanding the Ice Age. You can't just have an Earth getting colder and colder. Everything would freeze over.
Ken says you can't get an ice age by everything getting colder because then everything would freeze over. Maybe I'm missing something, but using cold to freeze things seems, to me, like a great way to get an ice age.
The ice on Greenland and Antarctica is in places miles deep and hundreds of miles wide. In the present, however, all but the edges of these ice sheets are cold deserts. Not enough snow and ice falls there to build up the depth of ice that we find today, even if long periods of time were available.
They admit that the edges get plenty of moisture and only the interiors are desert. But if new ice can form at the edges, then the ice caps can grow. Wind can also blow already fallen snow from the edges towards the center, piling it up thicker. This is an empty claim that natural forces can't explain the ice sheets.
Evidence in fossils suggests that the oceans were warmed up in the course of the flood.
The average temperature of the ocean is 39 degrees Fahrenheit. Well, after the flood, it could have been an average of about 86 degrees Fahrenheit.
What evidence? From the picture they showed, I assume they mean that organisms which lived in warmer water were found higher in the geologic column. But I'm pretty sure that doesn't match reality. This is just a claim that it could have been balmy in the Arctic, but no evidence of it being so warm is ever presented.
The key here is that for that warm water, you evaporate so much more water vapor in the air.
As the oceans cooled after the flood, heavy snow began to fall. Computer simulations that begin with warm oceans show snow falling far inland over cool continents. Ice sheets build up thousands of feet thick, where we see evidence for such ice today. This ice built up in only a few centuries of time. The whole process was sped up by volcanic ash cooling the earth after the flood.
After thinking about this for a while, I think this is meant to be a lot like tossing a pot of boiling water into polar temperatures, or like how a hot spring generates clouds on a cold day which fall to snow nearby. If this model is based on there being so many volcanic aerosols that the sun is basically blocked out, but the waters are very warm and of such mass that it takes forever for them to cool, then sure, I could see the clouds rolling off the waters turn to ice on the land. The problem I see is that aerosols only cool the surface of the Earth by reflecting sunlight. It doesn't reduce the Earth's ability to retain heat. In fact, the many clouds, both normal and of ash, would retain any heat generated underneath them. Heat generated, for example, by massive amounts of water condensing, cooling, and freezing. And on top of this failed explanation, there is still the massive sorting problem of the rock layers, which isn't even mentioned in this video. There's the heat problem, which Erica of Gutsick Gibbon has done a wonderful series on. I'll link it here. The model needs to account for everything, and unless it appeals to miracles, it only accounts for the facts if we squint at them.
See, if you don't believe in the flood, you don't understand the flood, you won't understand the Ice Age.
To bring this back around, the actual point Ken is trying to make is that natural processes can't account for the Ice Age, only the flood can, and so the Ice Age is evidence for the flood. Literally no evidence for this is provided, just a hand wave that the glaciers are too dry to be able to grow. This is not remotely close to considering all possible natural mechanisms and a lazy attempt to make a point.
There's another aspect to that as well. The Bible says there's never going to be another global flood, which means we'll never have an ice age as we've had in the past.
This is actually a falsifiable statement, but unfortunately it'll take at least a few tens of thousands of years to falsify, if humans don't override the natural cycles. In the meantime, we'll put it down as an argument from ignorance that there's no natural mechanism.
Now, some people say to me, yeah, but I read in the Bible that a day is like 1,000 years. Who's heard someone say that to you? A day is like 1,000 years. I tell people, oh, you mean that passage in 2 Peter chapter 3? Yeah, read the rest of the verse and it says 1,000 years are like a day. That just cancels that one right out, doesn't it?
I don't care about the intended interpretation of the Bible and whether days means days or eons, but Ken needs to stop pretending that everything is so obvious and that his interpretation of reality is so clearly superior to everyone else's. So I'm going to teach Ken a lesson. He just said to read the rest of the verse. I say to read the rest of the intended paragraph because verse divisions are nearly arbitrary and were added later. 2 Peter 8-9 reads, "But do not forget this one thing, dear friends. With the Lord a day is like 1,000 years, and 1,000 years are like a day. The Lord is not slow in keeping his promise, as some understand slowness. Instead, he is patient with you, not wanting anyone to perish, but everyone to come to repentance." Ken's interpretation of the first verse is that a day to God is like 1,000 years to us, and 1,000 years to God is like a day to us. In short, it's a poetic way of saying that God's experience of time is entirely alien to ours, with God being outside of time. But then verse 9 would stand by itself to explain the Lord is not slow to fulfill his promises, he is just patient with us. The different perceptions of time don't add anything to this. But my interpretation is obviously superior. My interpretation of the first verse is that a day to God is like 1,000 years to us, and 1,000 years to us are like a day to God. Now it's poetic repetition, and it fits much better with the following verse. The promise being referred to, the one that's taking thousands of years to keep, is clearly the second coming of Christ. It took 3 days for him to rise. It'll take 3 days for him to return. But we must be patient, for the 3 days to return are like 3,000 years to us. We're 2/3 of the way there. That's what these verses are saying. Duh. Now, my point here is not to actually convince anyone of my theology. I don't believe that the word of the Bible can even be taken as true. But were I a Christian, the intended meaning of the word day in the context of Genesis would not be obvious to me.
Then people say, well, what about all the dating methods that seem to indicate billions of years? Actually, there are hundreds and hundreds of dating methods that you can use to age date things on the Earth. See, one creation scientist I know makes this statement. He says 90% of the methods you can use to age date things on the Earth contradict the billions of years.
First, note that he said creation scientist, not scientist, so this isn't a quote from a real scientist. And sure, many of the methods will produce contradictory results. That's because many of the methods are limited in the time frames they can measure. Radioactive dating can't provide accurate dates more than about a dozen times the half-life of the isotope, and always have error bars attached that are on the order of 1% of the half-lives. Isotopes whose half-lives are much larger or smaller than the actual age of the material don't produce good results. Actual scientists know this and avoid calling results conclusive when they don't come out in the range that the isotope can accurately measure.
But all dating methods have fallible assumptions. Who's heard carbon dating used to supposedly prove millions of years? Put your hand up. You know, there's a misconception out there in the culture. Do you realize that carbon dating has nothing to do with millions of years? It can't do.
Yep, that's what I just said. Carbon-14 has a half-life of a little over 5,000 years and can't be used accurately on objects more than about 50,000 years old. Any result of carbon-14 dating that comes out as millions of years is inaccurate, and any date scientists quote of millions of years is supported by a dating method other than carbon.
First off, many scientists now regard the age of the Earth to be between 4.55 and 4.6 billion years old. Okay, so if this method is reliable and accurate, why the 50 million year discrepancy? That seems like a lot, but
I actually gave myself a concussion when I slapped my forehead after hearing this. 50 million years is a lot to us, but it is nothing to the 4.5 billion years in question. Again, error bars are usually about a percentage of the half-life, and something with a half-life of billions of years is needed to measure the ages of billions of years old rocks. Let me put it another way. If we first tried carbon dating on these rocks, it would give an age in the hundreds of thousands of years, which can't be an accurate result for this isotope. So we try again with an isotope that has a half-life of hundreds of thousands of years, and this time the age would come out as tens of millions of years. This is again too large to be accurate, and so we apply an isotope that has a half-life of tens of millions of years. This time it comes out as billions of years old, which is still inaccurate. Finally, we look at the thorium or other long-lived isotopes whose half-lives are billions of years, and we get a result of 4.5 billion years. This result is accurate for the isotope, so that's the answer.
the dating clock started when the rock cooled. During the molten state, it is assumed that the intense heat forced any gaseous daughter elements to escape. It is assumed that once the rock cooled, no more atoms escaped, and any daughter element now found in the rock is a result of radioactive decay since that rock formed.
There is no assumption, and it has nothing to do with whether the daughter elements were gaseous. Only certain kinds of minerals that meet specific criteria can be used. We need to know the chemistry of the mineral well enough to know that it cannot form with daughter nuclides inside, and that it will lock in parent and daughter nuclides once the mineral is formed. Zircon is a great example of this, as geologists can synthesize it in a lab and understand its chemistry well. It rejects lead while it is forming, while uranium can be incorporated, so any lead found in the mineral is a result of radioactive decay. It is also a very resilient material that doesn't allow any new parent nuclides to infiltrate into the mineral after it is formed.
We can't directly measure the ages of rocks. There are assumptions involved. For instance, how do we know what the initial conditions were in the rock sample?
We don't need to know every detail. As long as we have a mineral whose chemistry we understand well enough to know that it rejects daughter nuclides when it is forming, even if the daughter is present, then we can assume that there were no daughters at the time of the formation. We don't need to know anything about how many parents were there, since it's the ratio of daughter to parent that matters, not the absolute amount. Furthermore, at least with the uranium chains, lead-204 isn't produced by radioactive decay, so we can double-check that there isn't any to confirm that no lead was present at the time the mineral was formed.
How do we know the amounts of parent or daughter elements now in that sample haven't been altered by other processes in the past?
The only thing we really need to worry about with zircon is lead loss, and we have ways to account for this. Lead-206 comes from the decay chain of uranium-238, while lead-207 comes from uranium-235. The half-lives of the decay chains are 4,500 and 700 million years, both capable of measuring ages in the range of 1 to 5 billion years. Since they produce daughters at different rates, the ages won't agree if lead leaks out. If they do agree, then the ages are accurate.
How does someone know the decay rate has remained constant since the rock formed?
Nuclear physics is something science understands very well. Decay rates are based on the stability of the nucleus and is thus a material property. Material properties don't change over time. And sure, I'll grant that this is an assumption, but it is one which should be easily falsifiable, and yet it has never been falsified. Good enough for me.
Let's say you walk into a room and you see an hourglass with sand at the top and sand at the bottom, and some sand sprinkling from the top chamber to the bottom. Well, observational science would allow us to see and measure the sand, and then calculate how long the hourglass has been running, right? We could make our sand measurements and then calculate when the hourglass was turned over, right? Well, those calculations could be wrong, because we may have failed to consider some major assumptions, like, was there any sand at the bottom when the hourglass was turned over? Has any sand been added or taken out of the hourglass? Has the sand always been falling at a constant rate? Since we did not observe the initial conditions when the hourglass started, and we haven't been watching the sand all the time since then, we must make assumptions.
The more accurate analogy would be if there were 3 hourglasses linked together to all turn over at the same time. At the moment they get flipped and start running, they all have a known ratio of sand in the bottom. If they leak, they all leak together proportionally to how much is in the bottom. One of the glasses has no sand in the top, and the other 2 fall at different rates. The math whizzes among you can tell that there is actually enough information here to tell how long the sand has been falling, even without assuming how much sand there was in the bottom to start, and that the glasses didn't leak.
Now, of course, there's more to understanding all of this, but enough said.
I agree that answers in Genesis have said enough, but there is much more to understanding deep time and evolution, and the best place you can start is by asking as many questions as you can without deciding beforehand that the answers are wrong. That's what these biblical literalists do, and it's a core part of why they demonstrate time and time again that they don't understand science. They don't understand the scientific method, they don't understand what evidence there is for deep time and evolution, they don't understand how logic can function without God, they don't understand the Big Bang, they don't understand DNA, and all because they are set on their preconceived notions of biblical literalism. So that's it. Ken wraps up the last few minutes telling Christians how to be Christians, which I couldn't care less about. So to conclude, the Earth is billions of years old, a global flood didn't happen, evolution is possible, and you should go read a fucking book.